What is your top takeaway from round one?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting thing because, like, we have to see both sides of this. We're so entrenched in college football, but, like, this is really an NFL event. And so I think our thoughts and, like, how much we've seen guys certainly impacts the way that we look at it. For me, I will say there's, like, the contrast between what happened in last year's draft and what happened last night is really intriguing to me because it was, just like all offense. It was the first 14 picks last year. Were offensive picks. And this year you saw a bit of a difference where maybe there wasn't like that knockout wide receiver class. And certainly the quarterbacks were a bit questionable. I think people like the offensive line, but they're looking over at the defensive line and they're looking at linebackers even and saying that they've got some guys there that were pretty good. So I would say just like the overall how rounded out this class was in terms of different positions that people saw value in really stood out to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that it was a storyline going in. I mean, it was the story of the Heisman race, right? We were talking about non-quarterbacks. We talked about how, the SEC didn't have a top 10 finisher in the Heisman. Usually SEC quarterbacks are there. It was definitely the story of the season and of the draft, the quarterback position. So Cam Ward goes number one, as we all expected. That was pretty telegraphed. And honestly, I think that the top four, at least maybe 5, 6, went in the order of players that we saw in a lot of the mocks, going to Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter, Will Campbell, and then Mason Graham. But obviously it was that trade and the Jags being really aggressive to get up to 2 so that they could get Travis Hunter that I think was absolutely the headliner. I mean, we don't always see trades that high. Not since 1997 has a team moved inside the top 2 to pick a non-quarterback, and that's when the Rams took offensive tackle Orlando Pace. Not since 2007 has a wide receiver gone that high when the Lions took Calvin Johnson. Both of those players are in the Hall of Fame, so no pressure to Travis Hunter there for being traded up 4 at that level. But yes, the question was, like, what teams did they go to? I think Ashton Jeanty, we were expecting to be in that 5 to 10 range. A lot of teams seemed very interested in him. He is one of those game breaker unicorn running backs, I think, that we have talked about. We love him as a player, as a person, but we've seen teams reach for Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, and then produce and be that guy that we want to see them be in the NFL. High expectations for Ashton Jeanty. He goes to Chip Kelly's offense in Las Vegas, which I think is really interesting, coming off of the way that we saw him use run game at Ohio State last year. You end up having Teteroa McMillan go at number 8. So I was wondering about this, if we'd have a wide receiver drafted before a tight end. We do. And then the tight ends, you have Colson Loveland go ahead of Tyler Warren, who falls into the Indianapolis Colts, which, I mean, I don't think there were a couple picks in the first round where like need meets value meets like perfect place. And Tyler Warren going to the Colts was one of them. But as predicted, and as you said, Joshua, a lot of defensive tackles, a lot of edge guys. You're seeing offensive linemen, like the best offensive linemen were all off the board by pick 9, right? And then, obviously you have Tyler Booker go to the Cowboys. But it was a rush for those types of positions that I think people thought that there would be a plenty, and they were able to get their guys, I think, most of the time in the first round. But like you said, I mean, the lack of quarterbacks, lack of receivers, that's what jumps out when you look at the first half of the first round.
Yeah, and let's keep this graphic up here for a sec. I actually felt like the first 7 picks were chalky to me, right? Like you could have made a very reasonable case that those would be the first 7 picks based off of need and based off of how well these players performed and tested. 8 to me is where it got interesting, because Ted McMillan was a guy who people thought could go as high as 4 to the Patriots when we first got started with this back in January. And then it was like, oh, maybe he's a mid-teens guy, or maybe he even goes in the 20s. Like, we don't know if he's that true game breaker. And the Panthers say, no, we're going to pull the trigger on him there. So I think that made some people adjust what their draft boards look like. We'll get into the Colson Loveland and Tyler Warren deal. I'm pretty locked into, live here in Chicago, what the Bears were doing. And I just think they were super enamored with having a guy whose biggest trait at tight end would be catching the football. with Ben Johnson, their new head coach, and with Cole Kmet already on that roster. So I think that makes sense there. And for the Colts, it allowed them to kind of let the board fall to them instead of having to make a move to draft up, which people predicted they might have to do if they wanted to get Tyler Warren. So that was intriguing. Then the last thing I'll say, and we'll have a big Ashton Jeanty conversation here, but there was a little bit of a late push and some teams trying to wheel and deal to maybe move up in position to get him. I know the Bears had kicked the tires on potentially making that happen. I think they made the right decision by staying at 10 and just drafting where they were at, because I value the second round picks that they have. But Ashton Jeanty was one of those guys who by the end of this became a can't miss prospect. And for teams that were in the market for a running back, which we've seen with Saquon Barkley, we've seen with Derrick Henry and some of the guys that you mentioned, Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Jonathan Taylor, that is now a value premium position in the NFL. Teams are running the football. They realize it's a way to win football games. And so you see a running back go as high as we've seen in a long time with a lot of teams that were in pursuit of him.
Yeah, completely agree. And I want to underscore that because just a couple of years ago, the narrative was you didn't need a first round pick on a running back because they're a dime a dozen, get them for a few years. And now we're seeing for those special players that people are going to give up a lot and make sure that they go and get them. Will Campbell, by the way, goes 4 to the Patriots. So you saw a lot of teams addressing their biggest need, right? Like that's big for Drake May. And when you mentioned the Panthers taking McMillan, you know, you're giving you're giving a receiving threat and trying to help with the pass game there. Let's quickly look at the second half of the first round before we get into some of the other top storylines. A couple of guys that pop out. I mean, we've talked about Shamar Stewart a lot, a guy that didn't have the stats and the production, but certainly was that freak athlete. And so he was kind of a great example at 17 to the Bengals of the idea between, you know, athleticism, potential versus production, and having that conversation with him. A couple picks that I really like in the back half of the first round. We both love Emeka Egbuka. I think he was overshadowed because there were the younger receivers that he was with, certainly last year with Jeremiah Smith, but I think he's going to be a fantastic pro and like just be there for a very long time and just be a reliable threat in the receiving game for the Bucs. I love the pick of Amari Hampton to the Chargers. This is Jim Harbaugh, peak Jim Harbaugh, right? We've seen him draft offensive tackles. We've seen him emphasize the run game. He wants to win games the way that we saw him win at Michigan. And then number 25, the Giants come back and trade up, and then they take Jackson Dart instead of Shedeur Sanders. That becomes their quarterback of the future. Very interesting, and we'll get into that a little bit deeper as well. And then you saw some of these picks that, you know, it's like, how does the NFL let the Ravens get like a guy like Malachi Starks late in the first round? How does everyone let the Eagles take Jahad Campbell late in the first round? Because Howie Roseman loves to take those SEC defenders. He just like goes to Tuscaloosa or goes to Athens and is like, all right, I'm just going to take the best defensive players from these teams, and tends to work out for the Eagles. So those were what jumped out to me in the back half of the first round. But there's a lot of players that are like among our favorites in college football last year in this grouping.
No doubt. And I'll echo what you said about Emeka Egbuka. I think he's a guy, and it might not be like the super top end, but you're going to get consistent production. That was a smart move there. Shamar Stewart, the reaction on him was interesting. I was out on the guy because there's no way you should be as athletic as him and only have 4.5 sacks in your college career. It means that you don't know how to rush the passer and you haven't learned how to do it. So I'm curious there, especially with the defense that needs to get much better, how good he can be. We'll have to wait and see on that one. Packers getting Matthew Golden. I think you saw the reaction from the Packers fans.
Awesome
Draft
scene.
was out there
Awesome
in Green Bay. They needed to get an offensive weapon. It's not something that they've done in a very long time. So it was awesome to see that there. And then Tyleik Williams going to Detroit, and he was a guy where it was like probably early day 2, but there's an opportunity that he sneaks into the first round of the draft. Feels like a Dan Campbell kind of guy. Feels like somebody that can be really impactful for that defensive line there. I love his skill set. He's huge, but he's extremely athletic. And I feel like he's got that workman mentality that Dan Campbell likes. So a lot of great picks here, and to echo what you said, Malachi Starks to the Ravens, absolutely nuts. And then Jahad Campbell, I know there was a medical question. You had shoulder and you had to get surgery and maybe another shoulder that has to get surgery. But the idea that the Eagles were able to even trade up the spot to go and get him, and people let this happen. Such good value for who I thought was the best off-ball linebacker in this class. It is amazing to watch the Eagles do what they do.
I know you would think someone would stop them at some point here.
At some point.
And I think that they said afterwards that they had him like as a top 10 pick on their board. So to get a top 10 guy at pick 31 is crazy, but that's where they are. And that's why they get such great defensive players. They're really smart there and maybe willing to take guys, that maybe did have an injury question that other guys weren't sure about. Wanted to underscore the Matthew Golden moment. The Packers draft a receiver for the first time since 2002. They do it at home in front of hundreds of thousands of Packers fans. Amazing moment. And we saw it with Terry and Arnold get drafted by Detroit last year. It's so awesome to have a position of need and like a bigger personality type player, but to get that moment and just know, like, you've got to own it. Like, you're on the stage speaking to hundreds of thousands of people and like delivering. Incredible moment for Matthew Golden. So that was great.